Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I am Terry Martin with the Illinois Channel, and I'm joined by Jeff Berkowitz with Public Affairs Television. Jeff and I are going to be talking about some of the issues that we've just covered at the end of 2022 and take a look forward to some of the primary election issues and other issues that are be coming up in the new year 2023. And Jeff, as you and I come to the audience today, last night we just had a election in the U.S. Senate, and this is the results by county. As you can see, the rural areas went Republican. All the primary heavily populated areas went for Warnock, the incumbent senator, who has now earned himself a 6-year election term, I should say. And so now the Democrats will be holding a 51 seat majority, unlike the 50-50 seat majority that we have had and currently have. So from your perspective, what, if any, difference does this make since the Democrats already held the U.S. Senate chamber?
Quite a bit. It was a disaster. Tuesday, December 6th, will be close to the Pearl Harbor Day of 1941 for the Republican Party. Some may say, well, yes, the Republicans had already lost the Senate and the Democrats had the majority, but now instead of a 50-50 split, which they had before, 51-49, so all of the committees in the Senate will no longer be equal, Democrats and Republicans, but the Democrats will have a one-vote margin in all of those committees. More importantly, Senator Manchin, who was sort of the Republican guy to block things, it won't matter. He can go his own way because they got.
Well, he wasn't. You're missing. Senator Manchin from West Virginia is a Democrat. He's one of the very few that might be described as a conservative Democrat, if that, maybe more of a moderate. But he was the linchpin. He and Kyrsten Sinema. And so, I mean, some of the things that the Democratic leadership tried to do in 2020 was to get rid of the Senate filibuster so they could pass legislation with a simple majority. They couldn't do it because Kyrsten Sinema, the Democratic senator from Arizona, voted to keep the filibuster, a Senate tradition that goes back from the beginning of the Senate. Now we'll see if the Democratic leadership tries to strip the filibuster out of the Senate, and they could do that, and then they could steamroll the Republican Party consistently in the Senate with a simple majority on these votes.
But the change here is now the Republicans have the House. And so whatever they do in the Senate, the Republicans have the House. And unless they lose 5 seats, looks like they'll have a margin of 4 or 5 seats. They'll have 222 Republicans. They have 221 now. If they win the last race, they have 222. Mm-hmm. That gives them a 4 vote margin or so. So that's a big deal relative to the last term where the Democrats had both the House and the Senate.
That's true, but we should point out that in the Senate, of course, they confirm appointments, judges, so there are things that the Senate can do unilaterally that previously the Republicans might have been able to block.
Well, they slowed things down, and the ability to slow down will be going away. So you're right. Judicial nominations and putting them through the Senate, unless some senators who are more moderate are concerned about that for their election in 2024, they should sail right through. So that's the major change. And what I was saying about Manchin, he was kind of an honorary Republican sorts. Obviously, he's a Democrat, but he was helping the Republicans by not going with the Democrats. His leverage will be much, much lessened at this point because now it's 450.
As long as the other, what I'll be looking for, and I think what's critical for those who don't want a Chuck Schumer agenda going through on everything is, will not only Manchin but will Kyrsten Sinema vote to maintain the filibuster. She did before. If Manchin also votes to keep the filibuster, then that will stay. That's one issue. There are a growing number of senators who oppose what's going on with the border. They see the high influx, so that's another issue on all the immigration, and we'll have to keep an eye on that as well. But before we close out on the federal government, because we got a lot to talk about Illinois, we have, because the House, the Republicans, as you note, have the House of Representatives, but their margin is so thin that there are currently about 5 Republican House members who say they're not going to go along with presumptive House Speaker Kevin McCarthy of California, who has been the leader of the Republican caucus. So that's another fight, and it just goes to show that it seems the Republicans often are fighting in a ununified way, if that's the term, and at crosshairs, where they should be celebrating their victory of taking the House back. Here we have somewhat of a mean-spirited fight among Republicans. We'll have to see. That's still, as we sit here, unresolved. But
well, Terry, it's going to get much worse because this was supposed to be a big red wave, and it was a disaster. It wasn't even a red ripple. The only thing they had is they barely won the House, but it was a disaster in the Senate races. So the 800-pound gorilla in the room, who you haven't mentioned, is Donald Trump. There's a big fight brewing, and in terms of getting ready for 2024, there's only 2 years left. That may seem like a long time, but it's not. And many people view Trump as the problem, why the Republicans did so poorly. Many Republicans view that. Many, of course, still are on his side and are his big cheerleaders. How that's going to get resolved over the next year as the run-up to the primaries in 2024 starts, and that presidential primary, will Trump still be a contender? Will it be Ron DeSantis, the Republican governor from Florida, who will be?
Yeah, DeSantis had a big win in Florida, and a lot of people say, look, if we go with DeSantis, and with a lot of people within the Republican Party are saying, if we go with DeSantis, we get the same policy prescriptions, more or less, that we get with Trump, but we don't have Trump's baggage and some of his statements. So that certainly is going to be one of the main themes. Also, as we sit here, we have in Illinois new leadership. Jim Durkin, Representative Jim Durkin had led the Republicans in the Illinois House for, seems like at least a decade, is now given up the leadership. The new leader is Toni McCombie. She is going to be taking over the House leadership. And on the Senate side, John Curran, who stands, by the way, about 6'7", is going to be the new leader of the Republicans in the Senate. They're both going to have their work cut out for them, as the Democrats still have supermajorities in both the House and the Senate in the Illinois legislature.
They grew them in the House considerably, and so it may be 70. One race hasn't been decided for sure yet, but it looks like it's likely to be 78 Democrats and 40 Republicans in the Illinois House. So that has grown considerably, the supermajority. In the Senate side, the Republicans did pick up 1 seat, so there the supermajority been narrowed slightly to 40 Democrats and 19 Republicans.
So as I put up the graphic, Jeff,
that's the way it was. It may go to 39-41.
Is the Illinois Republican Party dead? They don't have the wherewithal, it seems. They don't have the money. They can't compete against Pritzker's billions and the millions that he throws into these races. So they're left like beggar kids out on the street, unable to really marshal the kind of financial resources they need. And as we look at what's happened over the last 20 years, we have so many leaving Chicago, Democrats leaving Chicago, moving into the county. The collar counties, which used to be heavily Republican, are now no longer heavily Republican. And so the once mighty DuPage County is at best a 50-50 proposition. I believe right now the Democrats have taken over the chairmanship in DuPage County. So, with that, the
Yeah, I may have said
Republicans
that. I may
can
have said
maybe
it wrong.
only,
The Republican,
kind of as we saw with that
the
map I
Repub,
had earlier of Georgia, where the Republicans hold the agricultural areas, and that's true in Illinois. You look at a map of Illinois, so much of the landmass votes Republican, but the major population centers are voting Democrat, and the Republicans just haven't been able to put together a winning combination in Illinois for quite some time.
well, let me just say, because I think I misspoke on the numbers, the Illinois House is likely to have a composition of 78 Democrats and 40 Republicans. The Illinois Senate, I believe, would be um, uh, 40 Democrats and 19 Republicans. So the main point is two very strong super majorities. And the question is, what can the Republican Party do with their new leadership? I saw some very short interviews with both Curran and McComey on Flannery Fired Up, and they did not at that point, which was to be fair, only a week after the November 8 elections or 10 days after, they didn't start to articulate an agenda. And that'll be really important. Will the Republicans, although they have no real control in legislation because of their small numbers in the House and the Senate, could they still articulate an alternative, a sort of shadow government, to start the motion in preparation for 2024, where they will have a platform to run on? What are the issues that the Republicans are talking about so they can start to bring about some change, at least in the composition of the House and the Senate? And to do that, you have to have a message. I think obviously they've been lacking that, and we'll see if that gets developed over the next year or so with the new leaders, Curran and McComey.
So, what if Curran and McCombie were asking for Jeff Berkowitz's advice? What should their agenda be, and what should they be doing to rebuild the Illinois Republican Party?
Well, crime continues to be a big issue, and we'll get into that with our discussion of the Safety Act, or at least some of that. But crime has just gone big in Chicago, big in Cook County, and big in the rest of the state. With the Safety Act, many are predicting it'll get worse. So that's something they need to address. The alternative, what would they do? How would they lessen crime? What could they do in terms of legislation? What could they do in terms of the bully pulpit that each of these legislators has to push uh, to push how we deal with crime in another direction. Education is a big, big matter. We've seen a lot of turmoil about shutting down the schools during COVID and exposure to what was being taught as we brought the classrooms into the home through Zoom. And so people are getting dissatisfied to see what's going on in their K through 12 education in the public schools. So parental control, parental oversight, and the main thing is 38% of the kids, according to Wirepoints, across the state of Illinois, only 38% read at grade level. And in many schools, it's like 1%, 2. It's ridiculously low numbers for reading and doing math at grade level. We may even have a slide on that, see if we can pull that up. But it's especially bad for minorities, for Blacks and Hispanics. And and this is a way of doing good politics and good policy for the Republicans to focus on improving the quality of education, not just in the inner cities, which is where it's most troublesome, but
Before we go to the
most
education
opportunity.
thing, let's talk a little more about the Safety Act. I think a
Okay.
lot of voters still haven't focused on this. It takes effect in January. People thought there was going to be a lot of reforms to it in the recent fall veto session. There was some changes. What, from your perspective, what did they change and did it matter?
Well, the biggest thing is they clarified and changed. They kept saying it was just a clarification. A major, major change in the delineation by the Safety Act as amended, 300 pages of amendments of an 800-page legislated bill, in terms of how we're going to decide, how we define what is detainable and what is not. So we no longer have bail, but with the decision that the courts will be making when they have somebody before them and they've been arrested and they're awaiting trial, are they detainable? And the act previously, the act made many felonies, most serious crimes, effectively non-detainable before trial. Prosecutors had to prove a threat to a specific individual rather than the old, more reasonable standard of a community threat. States attorneys around the state, there basically were two states attorneys of the 102 that exist around the state who favored the Safety Act as
I'm going to guess Kim
initially
Fox was
presented.
one.
Cook County and Reinhardt in Lake County. So you take those two, everybody was against it.
Yeah, law
And that was a
enforcement
little
is
secret.
almost across the board against the Safety
Right,
Act, and they're saying this is literally a criminals get out of jail free card. That
right, and they changed that, and won't go into details of that. But initially, the law was unclear as to all these folks who were in jail under the prior act. Would they be subject and able to benefit from the so-called reforms? And people were saying immediately on January 1, they would just turn out open up the prison gates and they'd be out. Well, that's clarified. Now they have to petition if they want to be assessed and evaluated under the new law. So they have to petition, have to have a hearing. And so much of the concern was alleviated in that sense. But, and effectively, the non-detainable crimes prior to these amendments included, this is non-detainable, aggravated batteries, burglaries, robberies, arson, aggravated discharge of a firearm, armed habitual criminal, gun running, firearms trafficking, and more. So the big change, the 300 pages of amendments that the legislature did pass in the veto session, it was that now a long list of felony weapons charges can be grounds for pretrial detention based on proving only that the defendant poses a threat to the community at large. Now we're back to that old standard.
what
Rather
about?
than
Let me ask here, as we see, we have Chicago leads big cities in homicides, over New York, over Los Angeles. What about that, Jeff? Are we still going to be seeing criminals arrested for murder? Are they going to be let go?
So this is a major change. So for all those people who said, "Oh, this was just a Republican talking point,"
It's
why did
not,
you do
but I
300
would
pages
say,
of
I was about to say, when we talk about the new leadership, John Curran, Tony McCombie, this might be an issue that they want to be focusing on and making this a case and trying to get some reforms. They didn't get it done in the fall veto, they being the legislature. Maybe with this new legislative team, that might be an issue. Now, you brought up,
if we have that other slide about the current crime, we may not have that available, but if we
we
have
do,
that
let me
slide,
bring that up, and here you go.
burglary is up 18%. Theft is up. This is in 2022 versus 2021, last year to date. Theft is up 59%. Car theft.
Yeah, we got it in front of us here
92%.
so people can read it there, so
Okay.
we don't need
So you
to.
can just see everything is up. And the big lie is that they're hearing from, oh, things are down.
Well,
Okay.
murder.
They're not.
Murder is down
Okay.
15%, and that's the only thing. Everything else. You look at car theft, 93%, and so we only have about 9 minutes left here. Let's not dawdle here too much, but the
Okay.
point is, with all the crime that we have going on in Chicago, and there's crime certainly in other parts of the state, but predominantly in Chicago when you're talking about Illinois, to have the Safety Act letting people out is people must be scratching their head and saying, what the heck are we doing? that could be an issue, as I say, for the Republicans. But the other thing, it's going to be an issue in the upcoming mayor's race for Chicago. Mayor Lori Lightfoot is up for re-election coming up. And
Terry, let me interrupt you just to say, why don't we maybe defer that? We can hold that for a week, the mayor's race, if we have to maybe touch on it shortly. But this is so important. We've just started to lay out some of the agenda for the Republican Party. We've touched on crime. There's still a lot to talk about there. Let's just touch on education and bring up that other slide we have, because it's so important.
yeah, we have low test scores here for the city of Chicago.
I mean, it's not just low test scores. And this is in CPS, Chicago Public Schools. They're not spending, just folks, wrap your arms around this figure, $28,000 per year per student. Only you get, what do you get for that? Only basically a few students can read or do math at grade level across the board in 2022. Black students, 11%. Hispanics,
In reading, 11% reading, 6% in math.
Hey, folks, if you can't do basic reading, and you can't if 89% are in reading at grade level, and 83%, that's for blacks, 83% for Hispanics, and the folks are and whites, we're a relatively small part of the population, and perhaps
How are these kids in Chicago going to be able to perform in any job? And any job they get, it's going to be a low skill job. If your math skills, only 6% can do math at grade level. If you can only, for blacks, only 12% for Hispanics on math, only 17% for Hispanics on reading, and as we see, 11%. You know, we're destroying the future of these kids, yet we're also crushing the taxpayers at $28,000 a year per student. You know, Jeff, that's like over 12 years of schooling. We're spending $336,000 per pupil in Chicago to educate these kids, and then we're not educating them. And, you know, one asks, where is the accountability if we had a defense contractor take money from the government and the planes they built didn't fly, the tanks they built didn't run? Someone would be called on the carpet and sent to jail. But with our education here, we're spending literally billions of dollars, and no one's held accountable for the failures of the education establishment and the fact that we're ruining these kids' futures.
Right, and some might minimize that and say, well, yes, that's bad, but that's only CPS, only Chicago. No, that's not true, because if you look around the state of Illinois, as Wirepoints has done and published a full report on this, around the state, the average percent for reading at grade level is 38%. And there are many so-called inner city areas in the state of Illinois, other than Chicago, like Decatur, like, Metro East areas and East St. Louis and so forth, where the numbers are similar. Decatur has 2% in some grades.
Let me bring up, Jeff, while we're talking on this topic here, and this is another Wirepoints slide, fourth grade math, so this is not just Chicago, this is Illinois, but look at Illinois in red, and way under Florida, way under Indiana, and both of those states spend less than Illinois is spending, and we see that here when we look at Illinois in red spending across the board, $16,006, the $28,000 was for Chicago. But here, look at in yellow, which is Indiana, they're spending $11,700 per pupil, and Florida, which has the highest scores as far as math test scores for fourth grade, they're spending only $9,500 per pupil. So, wow. There's another reason to move to Florida if it wasn't already good for business and the weather.
And where was this discussion in the election contest that ended just on November 8th?
When we talk about, exactly, we're given hopefully maybe Tony McCombie and John Curran some issues here that they can focus on. And another issue here, part and parcel, could be school choice. Why are we forcing people to send their kids to taxpayer-funded schools that are failing? Why not give them those tax dollars to use to have their kids go to a school that can teach them and produce results?
Well, and highlight that for all students to be beneficial to have school choice. If you've got $28,000 and you can take that and go to the school of their choice, of your choice, those parents have tremendous purchasing powers. And if you're a minority parent, Black or Hispanic, the reading scores and math scores are even lower. Your kids are being failed or facing non-performance even more so, and those schools are failing your kids. Wouldn't you like to have a choice? And wouldn't you like it if your legislator, Republican or Democrat, was leading that charge of offering that choice? Why wasn't that presented across the state for a choice for people when they were making choices about their state rep and their state senator or their governor, et cetera? Why weren't these things discussed? And maybe we only have a few minutes, so let's just throw it out and we'll pick it up maybe next week. Let's take a look at the slide on Illinois unemployment relative to other states. If we
Wait a minute. I'm sorry. Hang on one second. Let me go ahead. Go ahead and talk about that. I'll bring it up, but I want to make
the
sure.
Illinois unemployment rate is increased in October, and it reversed in the country. Over on
Worst
the
in the
left,
country,
here's
you say?
Illinois.
Yeah.
All these states, we're number one in being the worst, 4.6%. Why weren't people talking about that? And even if that number came out in October, that's the number. We've been over there on the left side, second worst for a long time. Why aren't people talking about that when they're running for state senate, for the state house, Republicans and Democrats confronting that? We'll see in the mayor's race, which we'll bring up next week.
And I
You
was going
look at
to
the
ask, to
six
what
states.
extent are these issues going to be applicable? Certainly, crime is going to be, but are people like Paul
Education
Vallis, are
is,
they going to
and
make education? Paul Vallis is an educator, ran big city schools. Is he going to be
and is
hitting
a big
hard on
champion of
that?
and is a big champion on school choice. And we can say for the first time, he's run a few times before for other contests as well as mayor, and he hasn't had much money. Now he's approaching $2 million. So he may have the vehicle to get out his message, will whet people's
Let me
appetite to
interject.
bring
We
that
got
all
one
up.
minute here, so let's give me your closing
And
thoughts.
unemployment, we'll just say unemployment in Chicago, terrible, okay, relative to the other big cities. So all these issues we've just discussed can be discussed with Chicago, which is supposed to be the engine of growth, economic growth for the rest of the state of
Okay, and we
Illinois.
got to stop
So
there. So, Jeff, folks, have a great holiday. We'll probably be coming to you next week. Until then, Jeff and I will say so long.